In this presentation, I'm going to talk about a delicate, controversial matter, the execution of Jesus, as it is recounted in certain passages from the New Testament Gospels, but we're going to also see one non-New Testament Gospel, the Talmud, and the Quran. The historicity of Jesus' execution is not a contested matter. In fact, there is overwhelming agreement for once among New Testament scholars on the following point, that Jesus was crucified at the command of Pontius Pilate, and that this event can serve as a cornerstone of any historical investigation into the life of Jesus. For some listening to this presentation, you might say that is such an obvious point, but nothing is taken for granted amongst historians of religion, including what is reported about Jesus in the New Testament Gospel. The Talmud, too, which together with the Hebrew Bible has determined the religious identity of virtually all surviving forms of Judaism, assumes that Jesus was ordered to be executed. And I'm going to suggest that the Quran, the Bible, so to speak, of Islam, overlaps with the Talmud and early Christian sources on certain points pertaining to the death of Jesus. So as I said, scholars of ancient Judaism and Christianity do not question whether Jesus was actually crucified by the Romans, although as we're going to see, the factuality of this event is questioned in Islamic tradition, while the Talmud presents an alternative story about the circumstances leading to Jesus' death. Controversy rather centers on the identification of the culprits for Jesus' death. So that's where we have controversy, not whether Jesus was crucified or executed per se, but who was responsible for his death. Before I embark on this matter, let me clarify about what I will not be discussing in this presentation. I'm not here to minimize the theological significance of Jesus' death. According to Christianity, the reason for Jesus' death transcends history itself. Jesus had to die in order to deliver Israel and save the world from its sins. From this theological perspective, the historical and social circumstances that led to Jesus' crucifixion are of secondary concern, since Jesus' death was a necessary fulfillment of divine will. From this confessional standpoint, it is not so important to determine the human actors who desired and arranged for Jesus' elimination. Presumably, even the method or manner of Jesus' execution would not be relevant from this point of view. Jesus, I suppose, could have been executed through crucifixion, strangulation, stoning, hanging, or to invoke contemporary forms of execution still used in some parts of the United States, electrocution and lethal injection. Or maybe we might even add the firing squad. I'm reminded of the comments of the comedian Lenny Bruce, who jokingly remarked that it is a good thing that Jesus was killed 2,000 years ago. Otherwise, many children would be wearing necklaces with little electric chairs around their necks. Just a joke. It's easy to forget that the cross was originally a deadly instrument of torture and terror used by the Romans to intimidate and eliminate any rebellion against Roman imperial rule. Indeed, it's at the cross that I would like to begin our exploration of the depictions of Jesus' execution in the New Testament, the Talmud, and the Quran. But first, I'd like to draw a historical sketch that can help us make sense of the social, political circumstances that probably led Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect or governor of Judea, to order Jesus' crucifixion, before tracing how the responsibility of Jesus' death was reconfigured in the New Testament, the Talmud, and the Quran. It is indeed common practice among New Testament scholars to establish a distinction between the so-called historical Jesus, that is, the biography of Jesus, that can be tentatively reconstructed through historical analysis, and the various accounts about Jesus' life that are retold in the New Testament Gospels. Attending to this distinction is important when approaching the so-called passion narratives of the Gospel. So that is the final sections of the Gospels that recount Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem, his arrest, and his crucifixion. All four canonical Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, agree that the title or something along the lines of King of the Jews was inscribed above Jesus' cross. The Gospel of John adds that Pontius Pilate had the inscription written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek so as to reach the widest possible audience. In fact, the Gospel of John reports that many Jews were able to see and read the inscription because Jesus was crucified at a location near the city of Jerusalem. See John chapter 19, verses 19 to 20. The Roman intent behind this kind of messaging is clear: to ridicule any Jew who would pretend to be or be perceived by the Jewish people as their legitimate ruler and liberator from the yoke of Roman domination. Nota bene, please note, the mockery of Jesus as the King of the Jews is Roman in nature, not Jewish. What I mean is that it would make little sense for Jews to mock one of their own in such a public and humiliating manner. The imperial agenda of the Roman occupier is abundantly clear behind the commission to execute Jesus in such a terrifying way. Historians of early Christianity once again agree on the following point: Jesus was crucified at the command of Pontius Pilate. But what were the circumstances that led to his crucifixion? We need to rewind a few days earlier, before Jesus was arrested and crucified. All four New Testament Gospels agree that Jesus made a final visit to Jerusalem around the time of the Jewish festival of Passover, Pesach in Hebrew. In Jesus' day, Passover was one of the major Hagim, Hag in the singular, a Hebrew term for the pilgrimage festivals that Jews were normally required to celebrate in Jerusalem. Incidentally, the Hebrew word Hag is related to the Arabic word Hajj, the great pilgrimage that all Muslims strive to make at least once in their lifetime to the holy city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And just as the holy city of Mecca multiplies in number each year during the Hajj, so too would the population of Jerusalem increase dramatically in the first century as Jewish pilgrims from all over the land of Israel and the diaspora would flock to the holy city to commemorate the Passover feast. At the time that Jesus ascended from Galilee to observe the Passover feast, Jerusalem, like the rest of Judea, was not under Jewish rule, but under Roman jurisdiction. Caesarea Maritima, rather than Jerusalem, had become the administrative capital of Judea, now a province of the Roman Empire. Caesarea, not Jerusalem, is where Pontius Pilatus, the Roman prefect, would have spent most of his time governing over Judea. Pilate would have gone up to Jerusalem only when necessary, to ensure that the unruly province of Judea complied with Roman demands. In any case, Pilate would have certainly preferred to spend most of his time in Caesarea. Situated on the Mediterranean coast, Caesarea boasted all the trappings that a Greco-Roman city had to offer: open markets, agorae, as well as entertainment centers, including a stone-built theater and a hippodrome. From the northeast, an aqueduct applied water to the city, which also featured public baths. The temple dedicated to Augustus in Rome would have been a familiar and reassuring sight to the Roman governor, while the harbor of Caesarea provided further comfort. Should there be any social or political disturbances, Pilate and his allies could easily escape to find shelter elsewhere. And the photo you have there is a modern photo, so a photo of modern-day Caesarea, but this is a drawing that kind of gives you an idea of what the city might have looked like during the time of Jesus. Incidentally, Caesarea has some great remains of a Greco-Roman city. I remember visiting that place and being very tempted by the beautiful Mediterranean waters, beautiful shore. I highly recommend a visit to the place. So I imagine that Pilate must have been in an anxious, even grumpy mood whenever he had to go up to Jerusalem, especially if he didn't have his cappuccino in the morning, right? He was Italian. Imagine, right, having to leave beautiful Caesarea and travel uphill and inland into Jerusalem, overcrowded with pious Jewish pilgrims who had gathered in the holy city to celebrate what could be considered to be the equivalent of the 4th of July in the US or Bastille Day in France. Passover, after all, celebrates the Exodus from Egypt, which stands for redemption from slavery, freedom, liberation from foreign oppression. However, at the time Jesus came to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, there was no liberté for the Judean nation. Instead, Roman and local authorities coordinated together and kept close watch to make sure that Judea remained a submissive client to Rome. The dissonance between celebration and reality must have been especially palpable on Passover, Jewish Independence Day, so to speak. And Pilate would have been keenly aware of this tenuous situation could explode at any moment. Pilate himself was known for preemptively and brutally suppressing any Israelite sedition against Rome. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian from Israel, relates how Pilate once sent a garrison of soldiers to squash a movement that was gaining traction after an unnamed man had persuaded a Samaritan crowd to ascend with him to Mount Gerizim, where he would unearth the sacred vessels that Moses had hidden there. According to Samaritan belief, Mount Gerizim, rather than Mount Zion in Jerusalem, was the site where the temple of the Israelite God should be housed. Pilate quickly crushed this initiative by sending soldiers to slaughter the Samaritan enthusiasts. The death toll was so high that the Samaritans filed a complaint with the Roman governor of Syria, which eventually led to Pilate's removal from office. Pilate's propensity towards violence is also noted by Philo, which you can see on the slide here on the right, a first-century Jewish intellectual from Alexandria, Egypt, who complained about Pilate's corruption and injustice, including the many illegal executions he ordered without trial. Jesus then must have been under Pilate's radar once he arrived in Jerusalem. According to the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus' entry into the holy city did not go unnoticed. Sitting on a donkey, Jesus was greeted by an enthusiastic crowd who rolled out their garments and welcomed him with cries of, "Blessed is the coming of the kingdom of David our father. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna to the Son of David." These proclamations are charged with political meaning and would have worried the Roman authorities. After all, David was Israel's most celebrated king and was fondly remembered by the Jewish people for defeating Israel's enemies and establishing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. One day, many Jews hoped, the rightful heir to David's throne would return and make Israel great again. Hardly music to the Roman ears. The unrest that Jesus caused once he entered into the temple area probably helped convince Pilate that Jesus could present a menace to the social political order that Rome wished to maintain. In addition to overturning the tables of money changers and driving them out of the temple precincts, Mark, the Gospel of Mark, alleges that Jesus did not allow anyone to carry vessels throughout the temple. I wonder whether Mark's account implies that Jesus did not act alone, but was assisted by supporters when he penetrated the temple area. How else could one person alone forbid all people from carrying goods into the temple area? Whatever the case, by making a public scene and then openly condemning the way the Jerusalem temple was run, Jesus had angered the temple authorities, the chief priests who administered the Israelite cult and were known to collaborate with the Romans to secure their own status and preserve Roman imperial interests. And as you can see from this passage here, from Mark chapter 15, verses 1 to 5, it's the chief priests, unsurprisingly, who had Jesus arrested and handed over to Pilate for further deliberation. According to Mark and the other gospel accounts, Pilate asked Jesus the following question: "Are you the king of the Jews?" This question reflects Pilate's pragmatic concerns in his capacity as a Roman governor entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining political order. As a Roman prefect, he couldn't care less about Jesus' religious observances or differences with other Jews about the proper way to follow Judaism. Thus, Pilate did not ask Jesus, "Why don't you wash your hands like other Jews before you eat bread to remove ritual impurity?" Or "Why do you allow your disciples to pluck grain on the Sabbath?" Or "Why don't you like pizza? It's Italian. You should try it with pepperoni." The Roman officials' concern was purely of a social political order. If Jesus actually harbored political ambitions of becoming the next king of the Jews, this would present a real threat to the kingdom of Rome. So far, Mark's depiction of Jesus' interrogation before Pilate seems historically credible. On the other hand, the portrait in Mark and the other gospel accounts of Pilate's favorable disposition toward a Jewish agitator and his reluctance to authorize his crucifixion, which he does only after considerable pressure from the local temple leadership and an unnamed Jewish crowd, does not fit so comfortably with the accounts of Pilate's brutality and corruption that are reported in the writings of Philo and Josephus. It is possible, of course, that Pilate was unusually impressed by Jesus' demeanor. More perplexing, however, is the claim in the Gospels that Pilate was in the habit of releasing a Jewish prisoner at each festival of Passover. In this case, a certain Jew named Barabbas, a rebel and a guerrilla fighter whom the Roman authorities would certainly not want to see released from their custody. Even less credible is the insistence of the local Jewish crowd to have Jesus crucified despite Pilate's repeated offers to spare Jesus, whom he repeatedly called the King of the Jews. See Mark chapter 15, verses 9 to 12, which you have before you here. How could a Jewish crowd during Passover insist on the crucifixion of a fellow Jew who only desired Israel's good? And why would a Roman governor, known for his brutality, be so willing to risk his political career by releasing a Jewish terrorist? It is at this juncture of the gospel narratives that the beginnings of a certain tendency in early Christian tradition become evident. The transfer of the blame for Jesus' death away from the Roman authorities to Jewish protagonists. With time, this shift of blame would increase in frequency and intensity. The Gospel of Mark, considered to be the earliest gospel account by most New Testament scholars, contains the seeds of this tendency, which becomes even more pronounced in the Gospel of Matthew, which most scholars believe was written after and depends on the Gospel of Mark. In a parallel scene, the Gospel of Matthew claims that Pilate yielded to the mob's insistence that Jesus be crucified after they infamously declared, "His blood be on us and on our children." That's Matthew chapter 27, verse 25. This verse has caused incalculable harm for Jews across the ages, as they were accused and even persecuted by Christians for many centuries for supposedly shedding the blood of Jesus. Only in 1965 did the Roman Catholic Church, for example, officially reject the Christian teaching that the Jews throughout time were Christ killers. The tendency to magnify Jesus' opposition to Jesus is further evidenced in Matthew's portrayal of the Pharisees' alleged involvement in Jesus' death. Despite the religious disputes recorded in the Gospels between Jesus and the Pharisees over such matters as healing on the Sabbath or the ritual washing of hands before eating, the Pharisees are completely absent from the Passion narrative of Mark. It seems that the Pharisees had nothing to do with Jesus' death. In fact, we can infer from a report by Josephus that the Pharisees expressed their dissatisfaction to the Roman authorities when a certain Ananus, a Jewish high priest from the party of the Sadducees, illegally ordered the execution of James, the brother of Jesus. And so here before you have an excerpt from the writings of Josephus, the first century Jewish historian. I've highlighted in red the affiliation of this high priest named Ananus. He belonged to the so-called sect of the Sadducees, and he took advantage of an opportunity when there was no Roman prefect yet in Judea to execute the brother of Jesus, James, that is. This was something illegal. They didn't have the right to do this without Roman authorization. And so you can see in the third paragraph where it says in the red font, "but is for those who seem the most equitable of the citizens." The Greek term there could be translated as accurate. It's a Greek word used sometimes in relation to the Pharisees. And so it's possible that Josephus is referring to Pharisees here. they went out and they complained to the Roman authorities about Ananas's comportment, and that actually led to Ananus being condemned and removed from office. So you can see here that if the group in question are the Pharisees, they're actually not against a member of Jesus' family, but for him. Nevertheless, when you go to the Gospel of Matthew, for example, which contains some of the harshest vitriol against Pharisees, there is the claim that the Pharisees came after Jesus' execution, which would have been a Sabbath that year, to ask Pilate to post additional security forces at Jesus' tomb until the third day, because they feared that Jesus' disciples would steal his body and, quote, tell the people he has been raised from the dead, end of quote, from Matthew 27, verse 64. This scene, which is attested only in Matthew, is polemical. A polemic is an attack, usually aggressive in its tone, against another view or people who hold such a view. Polemics are driven by controversies, often religious or political in nature. To illustrate the meaning of polemic or polemics to my undergraduate students, I draw their attention to social media as a fine example. There you'll find constant attacks on people's opinions or their very persona. These criticisms are often unfair, taken out of context, with little to no regard for the legitimacy of opposing views. I think that many writers from antiquity, be they Jewish, Christian, pagan, or other, would have done a great job if they were alive today, trolling others on social media, be it X, formerly known as Twitter, or Facebook, or whatever platform you prefer to use. In this scene from Matthew, there is a polemic responding to a polemic. After Jesus was crucified, the Pharisees, who by and large did not recognize Jesus as Israel's Messiah, would not have believed or hoped that Jesus would rise from the dead, let alone worry that his body might be stolen by his disciples so that they could claim otherwise. Here, Matthew is not reporting history as it actually happened. What I mean is, I do not believe that the Pharisees would have bothered to go to Pilate on the Sabbath of all days, immediately after Jesus' crucifixion, to ask him to post more guards outside Jesus' tomb. Notice also how Pilate, a Roman official, does not want to bother with this matter, according to Matthew. Unlike the Pharisees, Pilate says, you have your own guards, take care of the security of the tomb yourself. Rather than providing us with information about what happened during the time of the historical Jesus, this scene testifies to a Jewish polemic of Matthew's day that challenged the Christian claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. In other words, at the time Matthew was written, perhaps at the end of the first century, there were Jews who rejected the proclamation that Jesus had risen on the third day, based on the Christian testimony of the so-called empty tomb. They argued that Jesus' disciples had in fact stolen his body in order to fabricate this claim. The author of the Gospel of Matthew responded in polemical kind by claiming that the Pharisees had hired on the Sabbath, a most holy day in Judaism, additional soldiers, and that they had even sealed the tomb in which Jesus was buried. Matthew's Gospel contains, therefore, two different polemical reactions written after the fact. The Gospel of Peter contains a parallel scene which I share here to emphasize the development of the polemical tendency already present in Mark and even more so in Matthew. During the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, there was no canon of the New Testament yet, and so from a historical point of view, no firm demarcation between some of the traditions that are attested in the canonical Gospels and the non-canonical Gospels. Like the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Peter insinuates that the Pharisees, along with the scribes and the elders, bid Pilate to plant soldiers in front of Jesus' tomb for 3 days, quote, lest his disciples come and steal him away, and the people suppose that he is risen from the dead and do us harm, end of quote. That's from the Gospel of Peter, chapter 8, verse 31. However, this scene is set in the Gospel of Peter before the Sabbath day, although the Gospel of Peter goes on to claim that a crowd from Jerusalem came Sabbath morning to the tomb to see the tomb, whether the tomb had been sealed. That's Gospel of Peter 9:34, which you can see here on the PowerPoint. The Gospel of Peter also differs from Matthew in its claim that Pilate, rather than the Pharisees, provided soldiers, including a centurion named Petronius, to guard the tomb. This account seemingly implicates Pilate with the Pharisees in their plot to seal Jesus' tomb. Yet, in a subsequent scene, the Gospel of Peter continues its anti-Jewish polemical trajectory by claiming that Mary Magdalene and other women visited Jesus' tomb early in the morning of the Lord's Day out of fear of the Jews, since they were inflamed with wrath. Gospel of Peter chapter 12, verse 50. Now, suddenly, it's not just the Pharisees, but the Jews who are cast as opponents of the gospel witness. In all probability, however, it was not the Jews in general, but Pilate, along with the chief priests of Jerusalem, who agreed that Jesus should be eliminated to prevent any social political instability from occurring during Passover in Jerusalem. Indeed, the Gospel of Mark repeatedly states that Jesus was condemned by the chief priests and the scribes and delivered to Gentiles, that is, the Romans. See Mark chapter 8, verse 31, chapter 10, verses 33 to 34. From a historical point of view, I take it that Jesus' messianic claims, or at least the messianic excitement around his arrival to Jerusalem, as well as his attack on the temple administration, were sufficient factors to warrant his arrest and execution by the Romans. When Jesus' disciples, after his crucifixion, clung to their messianic hopes and preached that he had risen from the dead, they transferred the Jewish resistance to their proclamation back onto the story of Jesus' life. Although in the long run, this transfer of guilt would foment anti-Jewish sentiment, it was not originally animated by an anti-Semitic animus, but rather by an internal dispute between Jews on the one hand, who believed that Jesus had risen from the dead and was therefore Israel's vindicated Messiah, and Jews on the other hand, who were not persuaded by these claims. So in other words, what I'm saying is the depiction of a Jewish crowd bent on having Jesus crucified reflects certain circumstances posterior to the time of Jesus, when the Gospel of Mark and then the Gospel of Matthew, and we can add the Gospel of Peter, were written. At that time, many Jews were not convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, and this controversy is then reflected in the passion narratives about Jesus in the Gospels, canonical and non-canonical. As time went on, Christianity became an entirely clearly distinct religion from Judaism. And so this accusation that we find in the Gospels that the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus was weaponized by Christians, sometimes in lethal ways, especially after Christianity morphed into Christendom and became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Melito, for example, a 2nd century Christian bishop of Sardis, is often identified as the first church father to accuse the Jews of Jesus' generation and of all time of deicide, literally the killing of God. But the charge of deicide was repeated and developed by many other prominent Christian leaders, from John Chrysostom to Augustine and Martin Luther, the latter going so far as to call for the expulsion of Jews, the confiscation of rabbinic texts, and the burning of Jewish synagogues. The charge of deicide fostered other myths as well, such as the infamous blood libel, the superstitious and unfounded belief that Jews would kill a young Christian boy and use his blood to prepare matzah for Passover. At times, the blood libel became, bloody, inciting attacks and lynchings of Jews, including during the Easter season, when passion plays reenacted scenes depicting Jews as Christ killers. If I highlight the deadly effects of the deicide charge, which finds its roots in early Christian tradition, it's to contextualize what little is said about Jesus' execution in the Talmud. Along with the Hebrew Bible, as I said earlier, the Talmud, more specifically the Babylonian Talmud, is the foundational text of rabbinic Judaism. Most declensions of Jewish religion, even those that have reacted against rabbinic tradition, owe their identity to varying degrees to the Talmud, not just the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, as it is called among Christians. The Talmud belongs to what is sometimes called classical rabbinic literature, writings that contain teachings attributed to rabbinic sages who lived in Babylon and the land of Israel or Roman Palestine during the first 6 centuries of the Common Era. Besides the Talmud, there are many other classical rabbinic works, including the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Midrashim, rabbinic commentaries on the scriptures. The classical rabbinic corpus is vast. For example, it would take 7.5 years to read the Talmud at the rate of 1 folio per day. 1 page per day. In the vast sea of the Talmudic corpus, precious little is said about Jesus. The rabbinic sages of the Talmud show no particular interest in the figure of Jesus or in Christianity for that matter. They are largely silent about the rise of Christianity for reasons that elude us. When stories about Jesus are occasionally mentioned, they are, not surprisingly, polemical. Moreover, the paucity of texts about Jesus in classical rabbinic literature may have been shaped from Jewish polemics against Christianity that preceded the completion of the Talmud. These polemics, as we saw, are already attested in the documents such as the Gospel of Matthew, which shows an awareness of Jesus' Jewish claims countering the Christian belief in Jesus' messianic identity and resurrection. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that some of the polemical materials in the Talmud, and we're going to see one text in just a moment here, they may have been drawn from Jewish polemics preceding the Talmud. As Christians countered Jewish counterclaims with polemics that heightened Jewish unbelief and opposition to Jesus, the Jews ended up accepting the Christian charge that they were responsible for Jesus' death, but in ways that justified rather than incriminated them for their actions. In other words, Jews ended up accepting the charge of Jesus-cide, if I may. They owned it. Hopefully these remarks contextualize the following polemical story about Jesus from the Babylonian Talmud, which might otherwise shock Christian ears. However, it's no less offensive than the Christian charges of deicide mentioned earlier and pales in comparison to the Christian calls for expulsion and violence against the Jewish people. So let's read this text together, and I've highlighted some phrases in red. And it was taught on the eve of Shabbat, so that's the Sabbath, and the eve of Passover, they hung Jesus the Nazarene. And the herald went out before him for 40 days. Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned because he has bewitched, incited, and led Israel astray. Anyone who knows something in his defense, let that person come forward and plea in his favor. But they did not find any defense on his behalf and hung him on the eve of Shabbat and on the eve of Passover. Rabbi Ula said, and is it the understanding that Jesus the Nazarene was one for whom there should be a plea in his defense? He was an insider. And the merciful one says, quote, "You shall not have any compassion, and you shall not shield him," end of quote, quoting from Deuteronomy 13, verse 9. However, Jesus the Nazarene was different since he was close to the government. So that's our passage. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, from a tractate called Sanhedrin, folio 53, page A, or side A. And I based my translation from one of the manuscripts, the Firenze manuscript. There's a lot here that I could say about this passage, but because of time, I'm going to limit myself to a few comments. First, I don't think that this passage is of any relevance for researching the so-called historical Jesus. Even if it is a multi-layered text, the Babylonian Talmud as a finished project is a very late document. It was completed only around the 7th century CE. It's true that this Talmudic episode here is introduced by the phrase, "and it was taught," which you can see here at the very beginning, highlighted in red, in Aramaic, Vitanya. This phrase introduces traditions that are attributed to the so-called Tanaim, rabbinic sages who were active during the first 2 centuries CE, especially after the Roman destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. Still, the majority of these Tanaitic traditions, even when reliable, postdate the 1st century. Some of them may even be spurious. Second, the Talmudic passage on Jesus' execution shows very little acquaintance, let alone direct engagement with the writings of the New Testament. Peter Schaeffer, a professor emeritus of Jewish studies at Princeton University, argues that this Talmudic passage is a polemical counter-narrative that evinces knowledge of the narratives in the New Testament Gospels. I do not deny the polemical dimension of this Talmudic retelling of Jesus' execution. However, I see little evidence here or elsewhere in the Talmud of any real engagement with the so-called New Testament Gospels. True, the Talmud here agrees with the Gospel of John that Jesus was executed in a year in which Passover fell on the Sabbath. In the Jewish calendar, Passover begins on the 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan. When the Temple of Jerusalem still stood, the Paschal Lamb was slaughtered on the eve of Passover, so on the 14th of Nisan, and it was on this day that Jesus was crucified according to the Gospel of John. See John 19, verse 14. Because the Jewish calendar is lunar solar, so that means the length of the months is determined by the moon, but the years are determined by the sun, Passover always falls in the spring, but falls on a different day of the week depending on the year. For example, this year, which is 2025, the 15th of Nisan falls on a Sunday rather than a Saturday. I don't think that the agreement between the Gospel of John and the Talmud about the timing of Jesus' death shows that the latter drew such information from the former. The sages of the Talmud may have simply inferred that Jesus was executed on a Friday before Passover because of the original association between Easter and Passover, or from observing Christians during Holy Week reenacting and commemorating key moments in Jesus' passion, including his arrest and execution on Good Friday. From a Jewish point of view, the 14th of Nisan is the only reasonable date on which Jesus could have been tried by a Jewish court. The Synoptic Gospels, so that means Mark, Matthew, and Luke, suggest that Jesus was crucified on the 15th of Nisan, that is on the first day of Passover. But this is truly astounding from a historical and what we call in Rabbinic Judaism, halachic viewpoint. Halachic means like legal viewpoint. The 15th of Nisan is a sacred day in the Jewish calendar. How could a Jewish council gather on Passover to discuss the elimination of a fellow Jew? Imagine the U.S. Congress or Senate meeting on Christmas to discuss whether they should hang Mike Pence. Right? And so there's a problem that is well known in New Testament scholarship about when Jesus was actually crucified. According to John, the Gospel of John, it seems he was crucified right before Passover, but in the Synoptics during Passover. In any case, the Talmud disagrees with the Gospels about the reason for Jesus' execution, whereas the New Testament Gospels claim that the council of the chief priests and their associates accused Jesus of blasphemy and preaching against the Jerusalem temple. The Talmud accuses Jesus of practicing witchcraft and leading Jews to break the Torah by engaging in idolatry. The accusation that Jesus was a sorcerer of sorts is already attested in the writings of Celsus, a 2nd century pagan author who knew of Jewish polemical traditions about Jesus and claimed that Jesus had acquired miraculous powers when he went down to Egypt. Celsus also knew that most Christians of his day did not follow Jewish custom. He blames them for abandoning Jewish custom since Christianity derives from Judaism. Therefore, the Talmudic accusation against Jesus of leading Israel astray reflects a social reality that consolidated after the 1st century, when Christians had by and large rejected Jewish practice and were consequently perceived by Jews as preaching a foreign religion that they considered idolatrous. And you can see also here from this passage in Celsus that there is a polemic against the virgin birth and about Mary, claiming that Jesus was not born through a virgin conception, that Mary, in fact, had become pregnant through an adulterous relationship. We'll have to come back to this when we reach the Quran. Rabbi Ullah's statement, so to come back to our passage from the Babylonian Talmud, Rabbi Ullah's statement that Jesus was close to the government, in other words, had friends in high places, also reflects a later historical development as Christianity gradually became the religion of the Roman Empire. Jesus himself had no connections with people in the government. Rabbi Ullah, a Jewish sage from the 4th century CE, alludes to a time when Christianity began to accumulate political favor after Constantine became the first Christian emperor. Okay, so this is for me yet another proof that the Talmud doesn't have direct, reliable information about what happened during the time of the historical Jesus. This reflects rather realities at the time when the rabbinic sages of the Talmud were alive. I do, however, agree with Schaeffer's assessment that the Babylonian Talmud, quote, proudly proclaims Jewish responsibility for Jesus' execution, end of quote. The Talmudic version of Jesus' execution completely reverses the shame and guilt that early Christian sources ascribe to the Jews for their supposed crucifixion of Jesus. According to the Talmud, the Jewish authorities were right to condemn Jesus because he was a magician who led Israel astray from its sacred calling. And please bear in mind here, I'm just describing what the sources are saying, not endorsing any of them. The Talmud shows that even with the political ascendancy of Christianity, Jews did not cower in silence before Christian attacks on Judaism and Jewish unbelief. They continued to polemicize against Christianity into the Middle Ages and developed full-fledged counter-gospels about the life of Jesus, called in Hebrew Toldot Yeshu. Time does not permit me to discuss these works in this presentation. Suffice it to say that the earliest written fragments of the so-called Toldot Yeshu date from the early Islamic period, as early as the 9th century CE. Some historians, however, claim that the Toldot Yeshu predates the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE. Whatever the case, the Quran, which was probably composed some decades after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE, according to traditional reckoning, certainly shows knowledge of Jewish tradition and controversies between Jews and Christians. Consider, for example, the following passage from the Quran, which you can see on your right, which draws information and inspiration from the Talmud, this time the Jerusalem Talmud, or to be even more specific, the Jerusalem's Talmud's quotation of a passage from the Mishnah, which is a rabbinic text that was published in the 3rd century CE, tractate Sanhedrin. Here it says, I'll read from the Quran on the right, but you can see the text highlighted in red is paralleled in the Jerusalem Talmud. From that time, we prescribe for the children of Israel that whoever kills a person, except in retaliation for another, or for fomenting corruption on the earth, it is as if he had killed all the people. And whoever gives a person life, it is as if he had given all the people life. Okay, so that's from Quran, Surah, or chapter 5, verse 32. And so this passage clearly derives in one way or another from the Talmud. In fact, if you look at the wider literary context, which we don't have time for, in the Quran and also in the Jerusalem Talmud, it's dealing with the story of Cain and Abel. Cain, according to the Hebrew Bible, was the first murderer, killed his brother. And so there's a reflection there on how murder, of course, is wrong. If you kill somebody, it's as if you killed the entire world. But if you save somebody, it's as if you saved the entire world. And so we see this message in both the Jerusalem Talmud and the Quran. It's also in the Babylonian Talmud, but the Jerusalem Talmud here in its wording is closer to the wording of the Quran, as Holger Zelentin, scholar of Rabbinic Judaism, early Christianity, and the Quran, has noted. Likewise, the Quran repeats some of the anti-Jewish tropes found in the Christian tradition, such as the idea that Jews are spiritually blind and therefore opposed to divinely commissioned prophets like Moses and Jesus. The accumulation of parallels with biblical and extra-biblical texts and traditions from Judaism and Christianity demonstrates that the Quran was produced in a milieu, or we can even say several milieux, that included substantial interaction with Jews and Christians. The Quran is a product and a producer of these Jewish-Christian encounters. Interestingly, the Quran shows that the Jewish polemics we just saw about Mary, the virgin birth, and the execution of Jesus were circulating in the milieu in which the Quran was produced. The Quran polemicizes against these Jewish claims in ways that resemble and perpetuate Christian polemics against Judaism. And so here we're looking at another passage from the Quran, Quran chapter 4, verses 155 to 158. This is a prime example of this phenomenon. Reading from the text here, and the translation is taken from Droge. So namely the Israelites breaking their covenant and their disbelief in the signs of God, and they're killing the prophets without any right, and they're saying our hearts are covered. No, God set a seal on them for their disbelief, so they do not believe, except for a few. And for their disbelief, and they're saying against Mary a great slander, and for their saying, surely we killed the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of God, yet they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him. But it only seemed like that to them. Surely those who differ about him are indeed in doubt about him. They have no knowledge about him, only the following of conjecture. Certainly they did not kill him. No, God raised him to himself. God is mighty wise. All right, so that's the passage from the Quran. Undoubtedly, if you noticed here, the reference in this Quranic passage to the slander of Mary alludes to the derogatory stories about Mary originating from Jewish circles, already attested in the writings of Celsus and further developed in the Toldot Yeshu, which claimed that Mary was not a virgin at the time of Jesus' conception, but became pregnant because of promiscuity or some other forbidden relationship. If so, the Quranic depiction of the Jewish people claiming credit for killing Jesus, notice how the Quran depicts the Jews here as saying, surely we killed the Messiah Jesus, is probably a response to claims in Jewish sources such as the Babylonian Talmud declaring that the Jewish Sanhedrin was right to have Jesus eliminated. However, the Quran goes on to deprive the Jews of such bragging rights, so to speak, by denying that the Jews actually killed Jesus. According to the Quran, this only seemed to be the case to them. It was in fact God who took Jesus' life and then raised him. And so what I'm suggesting here is actually the Quran is not explicitly denying that Jesus was killed, only that the Jews killed Jesus. The Quranic rejection of the claim that the Jews killed Jesus is not motivated, however, by a concern to combat the Christian charge leveled against Jews of committing deicide. In the same passage that we have before us, the Quran portrays Jews as opponents of the divine will. It claims that they have sealed hearts and are serial prophet killers. These depictions are typical anti-Jewish tropes that stem from within Christianity and have their roots in the New Testament Gospels as well as the letters of Paul. Already in those New Testament texts, you'll find charges that the Jews kill their prophets, they constantly kill them, that there's a veil on their hearts. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians, etc. So rather, what I'm suggesting here is that the Quran is itself joining in an endless cycle of Jewish-Christian polemics by reinforcing the image of the Jews as chronic enemies of God's prophets and delusional in their claims that Jesus was a false Messiah whom they deservedly killed. To present-day readers and listeners, all of this polemical rhetoric, whether Christian, Jewish, or Islamic, may seem disheartening. Ironically, however, these frictions imply proximity between early Jews, Christians, and Muslims who seem to have known and argued about the competing claims of their respective religious traditions. New Testament scholarship now widely recognizes and affirms that all of Jesus' followers and arguably all of the authors of the New Testament were Jewish. They were part and parcel of the Jewish world they inhabited. It was precisely because of their Jewish heritage that they argued so intensely with fellow Jews who did not share their messianic convictions. I submit that the Quran be similarly viewed as a Jewish-Christian work. Jewish because it contains and adapts many Jewish traditions, both biblical and rabbinic, as we just saw. Christian because it endorses many Christian beliefs, such as the virgin birth of Mary, and engages in an anti-Jewish discourse that is Christian in its tone and form, even as it synthesizes a new religious identity in its encounter with both Judaism and Christianity. My point is that any reader familiar with the Jewish and Christian scriptures not to mention extra-biblical traditions that are attested in Jewish and Christian works, such as the Talmud and patristic literature, will be able to recognize much of the textual and theological landscape of the Quran. The same cannot be said, on the other hand, of other religious traditions historically unrelated to Judaism and Christianity, say Buddhism. The Quran, however, is still persistently viewed in the West as a foreign, exotic book written a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I remember when I used to be a doctoral student at the University of Michigan, when Borders, the bookstore, still existed. Remember bookstores? I would love to go to the original Borders bookstore in Ann Arbor, founded by the Borders brothers, Tom and Louis Borders, alumni of the University of Michigan. In the religion section of the bookstore, most of the books were, naturally so, devoted to Christianity, the largest religion in the world and in the United States. Judaism had a small shelf next to the many shelves of books on Christianity. At that time, the section on Islam was equally small in size, but where were these books of the Islamic religion displayed? Not next to Judaism and Christianity, but next to the religions of the East, Hinduism and Buddhism. I've observed a similar phenomenon at other bookstores such as Barnes & Noble. Yet Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all originated in the Middle East, and while relations between these three have historically been marked by polemics, significant progress has been made in recent decades that is shedding the invective and prejudice of earlier times. In 1965, already alluded to that date earlier, the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, commonly known as the Second Vatican Council or Vatican II, concluded. Out of this council came a landmark document called Nostra Aetate, Our Times, which radically redefined how the Roman Catholic Church should relate to other religions, including Islam and Judaism. The document Nostra Aetate rejects the long-standing charge of deicide against Jews throughout history and affirms that the Jewish people have not been rejected by God. It also emphasizes those beliefs that Christianity share with Islam. Nostra Aetate had a profound impact on interreligious relations, the effects of which continue today as many Jews, Christians, and Muslims celebrate its 60th anniversary. This is being recorded in 2025, 60 years after 1965. For example, in 2000, a document called Dabru Emet, Hebrew for Speak the Truth, was signed by more than 220 rabbis and Jewish intellectuals from various branches of Judaism, emphasizing the common ground between Judaism and Christianity while recognizing the theological differences between the two. Addressing 8 major points, Dabru Emet called for a new relationship between Judaism and Christianity in which the controversies that have plagued the relationship between Jews and Christians are set aside as they work together for justice and peace. 25 years after the publication of Dabru Emet and 60 years after the publication of Nostra Aetate, Jews, Christians, and Muslims have a unique opportunity to commemorate and reflect on their shared proximity without repeating the polemical sins of their past.